Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. But it's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and he pushed, and they flew. Okay, so some words from Christopher Logue there to introduce my talk tonight. So the title of the talk is called Becoming More Than an Individual. Becoming more than an individual. And I'm giving this talk in the light of all the others preceding it. So we're pretty well into our theme, building on emptiness. And we've been talking about becoming an individual for the last few weeks. And this week I'm going to expand on that and talk about becoming more than an individual. And we've been using this word individual with a particular flavour, with a particular meaning, a particular sense. And I'll do a little bit of summing up, but I'm just going to take as read that you understand what we mean when we're talking about being an individual. Because I was aware when I was writing this talk that there's a potential to grab what I say the wrong way and misunderstand it, a bit like grabbing the snake the wrong way and be bitten by it. So there's a bit of a health warning there. Yeah. So previously in the series, our last 4 talks, so they've been called Becoming Human, Becoming an Individual, Becoming a Free Individual, and last week Daniel talked about becoming a connected individual. Okay, and these were linked to the system of practice, or the system of Dharma life. So a lot in here, so I'll just briefly talk about what we've been talking about the last few weeks. So there's 5 aspects of the system of Dharma life: integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And for the last few talks, becoming an individual and becoming a connected individual, we've been looking at these first 2, integration and positive emotion. Okay. So another way to put this, integration and positive emotion, is becoming a happy, healthy human being. That's another way to put it, a happy, healthy human being. So last week, Daniel talked about becoming a connected individual. So connected to others through skillful actions, through positive emotions that connects us to other beings, to the world, and to a higher reality. And he said enlightenment is much more about the heart's release than the mind's release. And to summarise Daniel's talk, a member of the Sangha came up with a little anagram, which I've checked and I can't use it, but I thought it was so good that I thought I'd share it with you just to summarise last week, just so we're on solid ground. So the 5 grams of positive emotion, so becoming a connected individual through these 5 things. Okay, so gratitude, and Daniel talked about that being the emotional equivalent of wisdom. Through reverence, revering something higher, including nature. Through admiration, admiring those who are further along on the path, more skillful than us. By doing the metta bhavana, and by sympathetic joy, which is rejoicing in others' merits. So these are the 5 grams of positive emotion that we need to become a connected individual. And Daniel left us with, we're all interconnected, our actions affect others, we're all karmically linked. We exist in a really complex way, all related to each other, through an unimaginable set of conditions. So through these positive emotions, through these 5 grams of positive emotion, through becoming a connected individual, our edges, who we think we are, starts to blur. And we start to move beyond ourselves, move beyond becoming an individual. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, becoming more than an individual. Okay, so to take our title, Building on Emptiness, so far we've been talking about becoming bricks. Okay, so we've been talking about becoming bricks, solid, happy, healthy, human bricks. Yeah, so bricks you can depend on, bricks with true grit. Bricks that are happy and capable and interrelated. Okay, so that's what we've been talking about. And now we're moving on to what are we building? Okay, so what are we building with these bricks? So now we're starting to put one brick on top of the other, one individual on top of the other, as it were. And this is where the metaphor slightly starts breaking down if it hasn't already. Because building suggests confinement, so it suggests building walls, it suggests separation. So what we're actually building has infinite space. So you could say we're building a sphere with never-ending curves. We're just building something unlimited, an ever-widening circle. So collectively, we're building a Buddha land. We're building a Sangha. We're building a place that holds the conditions for us all to practice the Dharma together. That's what we're building. So tonight I'm going to do my best to open up what we mean by becoming more than an individual. I'm going to try and talk about some signposts. And for the material, I've relied heavily on Sangharakshita and Subhuti, some papers they wrote, called Revering and Relying on the Dharma, which after I read that paper, I asked for ordination. So really, really close to my heart, that, and a super personal force. Also from a man called Dharma Deepa, who led my ordination course last year. I spent 4 months with him on retreat. That's what I've used for my material, and I can point you in the direction, because there's a lot more to say than I can possibly say on this subject. So we're talking about becoming higher, greater than ourselves. Okay. So we're moving into the area tonight of spiritual death and rebirth, becoming more than an individual. So spiritual death and rebirth, dying and being reborn, strong language. So what dies? What's reborn? Okay, so I'll be opening this out, but you could say the sense of a fixed self, that's what's dying, and what's being reborn is something greater than that. So I was thinking of Pradaya's ordination, his leaving ceremony a few months ago now, a few weeks ago now, and it was called Entering the Tiger's Cage. So he who was Daniel went off and died, and someone else is being reborn. And the reason that we use that image, entering the tiger's cage, tiger's cave, is because there's only one set of footprints leading in, okay? And then we don't know what comes out. So spiritual death and rebirth could be called the area of surrendering to something higher, okay? So we've got a bit of a paradox here. The true individual, so a true individual in that sense that we've been talking about, a happy, healthy, integrated human being, a true individual, and then someone who participates in something higher, who surrenders to something higher. So this is a paradox, a spiritual paradox. So one question is, how can we be an individual and surrender at the same time? How can we be an individual and surrender? How to deal with this paradox? Okay, so to try and answer this question, I'm going to take it from two different directions. So one is using words, so I'm going to say some things. And then another direction is using an image, so I'm going to ask you to look at one thing. Okay, so words first, hardest part first. To describe this, how we hold this paradox, it comes from a core teaching of the Buddha called praticca samuppada, or conditionality. Okay, and very, very briefly put, it's that things are built on a series of conditions, and there's a pattern of regularity between those conditions and what they condition. Okay, so things are built upon conditions, and there's patterns of regularity in that. And the Buddha refers to a range of different relationships, and these are called nimas. Okay. So these are called nimas. Okay, so these are patterns of relationships. So the world's not a random place. we can predict what's going to happen. So these nimas, the Buddha didn't explicitly give this list, but a person called Buddha Ghosha in the 5th century started grouping them into patterns, and then this influenced Sangharakshita, who started this movement, and he put his own interpretation. So the nimas are regular patterns within reality, within experience, okay? So like I said, things aren't random, they're predictable patterns. So if you drop something, it falls to the floor. If you act selfishly, then you'll be unhappy, okay? So these are predictable patterns. So just as a way of signposting, there's 5 of them, and that's the second list of 5. So I don't think there's many more, there's 5 of them. So we've got the physical, the biological, the instinct that I'll briefly talk about, but really I'm concerned with the Dharma, the Karma Nima and the Dharma Nima. Okay. So the physical Nima, so that's about physics, it's about stuff. So you put certain stuff together, certain atoms together, you get rocks, or you put other stuff together and they explode. And you sort of know which ones to put together and which not put together, okay? So that's physics, briefly. It's harder than that, I know it's harder than that. Okay, biology next. Biological. Okay, so flesh and blood, human body ticks away until organs work and then they stop working. Okay, yeah, so biology. 3 years of university. Okay, the next one, instinct. So I'll briefly summarise this as birds of a feather flock together. So like inbuilt psychological mechanisms, instinct, survival, migration patterns, that kind of thing. Okay, so there are 3 sets of patterns within conditionality, within reality. Okay, so the 2 groups I really want to deal with are Karma Nima and Dharma Nima. Okay, so Karma Nima, a familiar word, karma. So this is the patterns of conditionality. Like, put it briefly, what I said before, that selfishness leads to unhappiness and selflessness leads to happiness, okay? So these are the effects of our volitional actions, how we act, and we can, we know acting ethically brings happiness, acting unethically brings unhappiness. So the area of ethics, skillful action. So this is karma. So we are our actions. Our actions are more important than we dare realise. Yeah, so something from Dharmadipika, he said that we should have the same faith in karma as we do in the law of gravity, which is interesting. So just as we're really careful about walking along the side of a mountain because we know if we slip we'll fall off, that careful should we be with our actions, how we act towards ourselves and other people, because it's the same thing, it's the same pattern of reality. Okay. So acting in line with karma, with awareness, we start building a momentum. Okay. So we act skillfully and we start building a momentum. We start becoming more creative. And the effect of that, the effect of acting ethically, is that we start to have a mind in which wisdom can arise, something can arise in that. And at that point, at a certain point, something else comes into play, okay? And it changes the nature of the game, if you like. So up until a certain point, we're working with karma. So we're working with ourselves, on ourselves. We're working to have a clear, positive mind. And at some point, when the conditions are right, we start hearing the soft voice of wisdom, okay? So karma is the realm of the individual, of being a true individual. And we start to enter the realm of the Dharma Nima, which is becoming more than an individual, okay? So up until then, you've been working with yourself, and then we step up into the Dharma Nima. And I drew a diagram. I like diagrams. Okay. So you can, we've got a spiral, and you can imagine that we're acting ethically, we're acting on ourselves, and we're creating momentum. So we all know what that feels like. So things are changing, we're expanding, we're acting more and more creatively. And at some point, the fifth, the most sublime pattern of reality comes into play. The Dharma Nima comes into play and changes things. So the Dharma Nima is the thing that I'm talking about. It drives spiritual death in rebirth. It drives becoming more than an individual. And the vehicle for this is traditionally called the bodhicitta. So you're acting ethically, you're acting in a certain way, your mind is becoming more and more expansive, and then something arises, the bodhicitta arises, and you start to become more than yourself, more than an individual. So within Triratna and within the Buddhist world, this thing here, the bodhicitta, has got all sorts of names. So it's called the bodhicitta, it's called the superpersonal force, it's called the third order of consciousness, etc., etc. There's probably more. And it can be a bit confusing to use lots of names for the same sort of area that can't really be named anyway. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to cross my fingers and call it the bodhicitta. And hopefully I won't go too far wrong. Okay. So this idea that we're working on ourselves and then something else takes over and takes us beyond ourselves, that saves, that particular presentation saves us from being tied up in knots. Okay. So the self working on the self, trying to overcome the self, is limited. Yeah, it's limited by its very nature. So as Buddhists, we're trying to overcome our fixed sense of self. But here we are, we've got a self, so that's what we're working with. And if you start trying to give up the self with yourself, you start becoming self-obsessed, which is the opposite. Or you can start becoming self-obsessed which is the opposite. And then the Dharma becomes unhelpful, and then the medicine becomes poison, and you're in trouble. Yeah. So because we live in such an individualistic society already, the presentation of Triratna is along these lines of emphasizing the expansion, emphasizing the Dharma Nima, emphasizing being connected with others. So it's expansion and connection that we emphasize, not destroying the self. So becoming more than an individual, not becoming not individual, if you see what I mean. This is the wordy bit. You'll look at a picture in a minute, don't worry. Okay, so the way I've been talking, it sounds like the bodhicitta, something comes in from the outside. So does the bodhicitta really come in from the outside? Could sound a bit dodgy, could sound a bit gaudy. Yeah. So this can be approached in different ways, because when we're moving beyond ourselves, we're trying to move beyond ourselves. So when we do that, then it might feel like it's coming from the outside because it's outside of us, it's outside of our experience. So the whole words of inside and outside are less useful. So it's equally true to say that it may be experienced as coming from the inside. Okay? So you could call it opening up to your wiser self. The bodhicitta, opening up to your wiser self. Okay. So that's the karma and dharma nima. That's the paradox between becoming an individual and then surrendering to something bigger, becoming more than an individual. Okay. So they're the two patterns, the bodhicitta arising. Okay, so now there's a picture behind you. So if you turn behind you and look at that picture for 30 seconds. Okay. So that is an image, a symbolic representation have what I've just been talking about. Okay, so the karma and dharma nima, going beyond yourself to becoming part of something more than yourself. Okay, so that's the image of Avalokiteshvara. So if you haven't seen it before close up, you might wonder what all that white circle is around the image. So that's all Avalokiteshvara's hands. So Avalokiteshvara has 1,000 hands. And you might have noticed that in the middle of that image is a pair of hands holding something to Avalokiteshvara's heart. So what he's holding is the bodhicitta. Okay, so he's holding the bodhicitta. So he's holding the bodhicitta, the will to enlightenment, the will to connection for all beings, holding that in the center of the image. And that's the center of the image. And outside are 1,000 different hands, which is symbolic of unlimited amount of hands, each holding something that has a use, that has an implement. Okay, and then Avalokiteshvara's got 10 heads. So the symbolism there is that through having 1,000 hands, each hand is an individual, if you like. You can imagine each hand is an individual with their individual qualities and their strengths, and they've come together in a whole, to make something that's more than an individual. Okay, so I realise I'm using more words to describe a picture. So I think that if you looked at that long enough, something would be communicated. And the story of Avalokiteshvara is really, I've always found a fascinating story. So Avalokiteshvara, so it's a mythic story. He started with a normal amount of heads, 1, and a normal amount of hands, 2, and made a vow to relieve the suffering of all beings. Okay, so not to become enlightened before they relieve the suffering of all beings. So made a strong vow. That ended up being too hard. Avalokiteshvara failed in his vow, and he shattered into 1,000 pieces, and then was built back together, but built back together in a way that he could fulfill his vow with 1,000 hands. Okay, so there's this idea of breaking, trying to do something, failing, shattering, and being reformed into something new, something more able. And I really relate to this part of the story because it's my experience that I'm constantly trying to do something, failing, shattering, then being rebuilt slightly better, and then trying to do something else, failing, shattering, rebuilt slightly better. Okay, so in the Avalokiteshvara story, this happens once. I think in reality it happens 1,000 times, and we get an extra arm each time. So Avalokiteshvara is a symbol for the Triratna Buddhist order. So he's a symbol for the order, and he's a symbol for the movement. So we're all trying to build a Buddha land, put conditions in place where we can progress through to enlightenment, to relieve suffering. We're trying to do that together as individuals, not losing our individuality, but working together for something greater. Okay, so that's at the center of the image. So another way to describe this is like an orchestra. So in an orchestra, you've got a beautiful sound that's made up of lots of different instruments. That's what we're going for. Okay, so the bodhicitta sounds all very well and good, but is it true? Is it real? And this is a good question. A question that I've asked myself. So is the bodhicitta real? Is it a real force? And I definitely can't answer this in this talk because I'm finding out, and it can't really be answered in words anyway, probably. And in the end, it's up to us to find out. There's some words from Rumi that I really like about finding things out from your own experience. It said, "From words alone you cannot know fire. Do not rely on the knowledge derived from others. There is no certainty until you burn." Okay. So there's no certainty till you burn. I've maybe been slightly smouldering, so I'll tell you 3 approaches, three ways to answer this question about the bodhicitta. Okay. So I've talked about it in a Buddhist context. So now I want to talk about it in another context outside of Buddhism. because I think this myth, this motif, this sort of pattern of reality, that something arises, something greater arises out of individuals, is really common. Okay, so it's not a clever historical Buddhist idea, the arising of the bodhicitta. It's the nature of how things are. And it's expressed in all sorts of ways by all sorts of people in all sorts of words and languages. So I want to mention two, first of all, so from the outside of Buddhism. One's a Christian Baptist called Martin Luther King, who I've recently been reading. And another is a Muslim poet and Sufi mystic called Rumi, who I just quoted. Okay, and interestingly, both use their own words about karma and dharma nima and ethics, love, and something else coming through. Okay, so Martin Luther King. So when I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which, of all the great religions, have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. Okay, that sounded very familiar. An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader context of humanity. Okay, so from a completely different tradition, the same thing ringing true. Something from Rumi. Love is my religion. Living only in the body and mind is a disgrace for me. Love has swept the dust from my soul, and now in the clear sky, the spirit moon is shining. For ages I have been beating the drum of love for you to the tune of, my life depends on my dying. Give up the known, give up your life for the mystery of love's eternal wine. But before I die, I said, I would like to know you. Once you know me, there will be no more dying. Okay, so both of these chime with me really strongly, okay, from outside of Buddhism. So I think we're talking about the same thing. But of course, I'm not a Christian, and I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Buddhist, because I know deeply for myself that the teachings of the Buddha express it most truly, and the practices he taught are the most effective at realizing it, okay, fully and completely. So that's why I'm a Buddhist. And the reason I'm a member of the Triratna Buddhist order is because I've got a deep knowing that from all the different expressions of the Buddha's teachings, all the different interpretations, this expression is the most effective for me, and I can imagine it can be the most effective for others. Okay, so although it's common, this particular presentation is the one I want to be a part of. And in my personal experience, this feels true. The bodhicitta arising feels true. It's felt true in certain moments of my life. So the general thrust of my life and the people that I meet, I get a sense of this truth. So sometimes I feel like I'm being driven by something different. Okay, so there's often in the midst of people who I share strong values with. Sometimes at night on my own, really late at night, I get this feeling that I'm being driven. And I joined the order last year, and the order is the Triratna Buddhist order. This is their whole area of vision. This is their whole area of expression. And I've given up things to do that. Okay. When I joined the order, I got a sadhana practice, which gives this, what we're talking about, the bodhicitta, it gives it a form, it gives it a way to connect. Gives me a way to connect to it. And I can't really say anything about it other than I feel like I've got a new pair of legs. I feel like I've got more legs in me. Yeah, I can run farther for longer. Yeah, metaphorically. And I can taste something of it, and I can taste something of it in other people. And really important that this is true regardless of lifestyle. So this is true regardless of lifestyle. So lots of people that I've met living all sorts of different ways, they've got every possible set of conditions to work, to become more than an individual. So it's not limited. So I've got a particular lifestyle, but it's not, I really see it's not limited to that. If you want to make it work, if you want to join together and be part of something that's greater of yourself, you can, because I just keep on seeing it. It's only my limited imagination, it seems, that puts limits on it. So it's not reliant on circumstances, related but not reliant. And this is also true, the karma and dharma nima also feels true in popular culture. So you've got Star Wars, you've got using the Force be with you, becoming one with the Force. So the individual Jedis coming together to form a super personal Jedi, dissolving into the Force. I haven't watched it in a long time. But I know it's in there, I know it's true. You've got the Marvel films, all the superheroes, the super individuals coming together to become something greater than themselves. So if you start looking for it, you can see it everywhere, in all sorts of disguises and in all sorts of language. Coming together to become more than individual is part of our culture, it's part of our myth. And apparently it's really, really common to have some sort of vision of this, that you want to be part of something bigger. But not so common to act on it, to remember it and to act on it. So to transform yourself and your life in light of it, not so common. So this is back to vision and transformation of the Noble Eightfold Path. We can have vision, the next step is transformation. So how does it arise? How does the bodhicitta arise? So we become true individuals. We put in the karmic work, first of all. We start going on this part of the spiral. We practice ethics. We cultivate positive emotion, skillful intention, generosity. We practice ritual. We sit in front of shrines. We meditate. We study. And then we join together to create a sangha, to create a spiritual community. So we give ourselves to it collectively. So these are the conditions for the bodhicitta to arise. So a little bit like we put in the work to make a lightning conductor, and then we stand there waiting to be hit by lightning, waiting to be hit by something else. Or we put in the work in making a sail, and then we wait for some wind to hit it. So we put in the work ourselves, and then something else comes through, something else takes over. Okay, so a quote from Subhuti. So how does the bodhicitta arise? We'll find our thoughts turning more and more spontaneously to the Dharma's deep truths as life flows around us. Then the moment will come in the midst of life when we can see beyond thought those truths reflected in every instant of experience. So the moment comes in the midst of life. And this, of course, includes an element of faith. So we need to be convinced in karma, convinced in ethical action, and have faith in the Dharma Nima, have faith in the bodhicitta. So we're in between these two, being convinced and having faith. So there's two extreme views of the Buddhist path, or two extreme views in this set. The path is very clear and we know what we're doing. That's one view. And another view is we have no idea what we're doing and we're all just groping around in the dark. Okay, so two views. And if you just take one or the other, it's disastrous. We need two. We both know what we're doing and have no idea what we're doing. Both is true. Okay, another good question would be, do we even want the bodhicitta to arise? Do we even want it? Okay, old ways die, new ways begin. Okay, old ways dying and new ways beginning is frightening. Okay, and we've got these words, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, so it's frightening. It's unpleasant. It can be unpleasant. We don't know what will be reborn, so we know what we're like now because that's how we are. So even though it might not be very good, at least it's known. So we don't know what we're going to be if we're reborn, if we're dying and reborn. So the unknown is frightening. It requires a leap of faith. You come expecting one thing and you get another thing. So there's different ways to answer this question. One interesting way, this is not for me, it's a Dharma Deepa again, is that fear is a reasonable response to samsara. Fear and anxiety is a reasonable response to our life because it's so fleeting. Yeah, there's such a fleeting nature to it. We have every reason to feel anxious because it's all a bit touchy. Yeah, it's all a bit, it's all very fragile. So recently I had a dream, and in my dream I knew I was going to die, and I was terrified, properly terrified, yeah? So there's a reason to feel fear. However, these practices were taught by the Buddha and his followers, who were beggars, who didn't know where their next meal was going to come from, who lived in the jungle, and who didn't have hospitals, yeah? So the only real solution to anxiety, this kind of anxiety, without papering over the craps, is to take refuge in something beyond ourselves, okay? So quite hardcore, but true, I think. And true, taking refuge, be going beyond yourself, that's frightening as well. So we've got two options of fear, so you decide which one we're more afraid of. Okay, so to bring it down a little bit, so this area of spiritual rebirth, of becoming more than an individual, I think it's missing. I see it missing in lots of different places and lots of different people's life. And I slightly bang on about being religious, and I think this is what I'm getting at, yeah, being more than an individual. This is what I mean by being religious. Yeah, I think I want to live a religious life. Yeah. But aren't we really terrible bricks? Yeah, we're not integrated, we're not fully integrated, we're not fully positive, etc., etc. So we're terrible bricks, yeah, so we're nowhere close to full integration, to being a complete, positive, happy, healthy human being. But if we wait around, nothing will happen, so let's build anyway. Let's build the Buddha land anyway, yeah? Let's build in emptiness anyway. We're not sure what we're doing, let's build in emptiness anyway. We haven't seen the plans, we don't know how it's supposed to go, let's do it anyway. Yeah? So it's sort of not one step after the other, it's like everything's drawn up by everything else, so let's just do it anyway. Yeah? There's no point waiting for integration and positive emotion to be completed before we move on. And spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, becoming more, breaking out of your set pattern of being an individual, and they come in degrees, small and large. Yeah, so there's levels of death and rebirth. The sort of worldly death and rebirth, which is just normally growing up. Yeah, and then there's from there spiritual death and rebirth, growing up and growing out. So we're changing in small ways, even big ways. So through practice, we might have left behind old stories of ourselves, old limitations, old patterns. Go beyond preferences. Traveling's good for this. You travel and you find out you've got all these preferences about being English, and none of the world shares those preferences. And you just have to, you have a small spiritual death and rebirth. You have to find another way to be. And recently I've been going through a small spiritual death and rebirth. And sometimes I don't recognise myself. So I'm definitely a better person, but it's slightly unnerving. And I've realised how damaging it is to hold on to personality types, like I'm this certain person and I do this, this and this. Because if I start doing that, I start believing it. Yeah. So I've been experimenting by practicing being an eternalist, which is basically moving from the focus that things will end to moving my focus to things will begin. Yeah, so what can I start? What can I begin? So I've got a little motto for myself, which is either I can be a man with problems or I can be a man with possibilities. And I need to decide which one I want to be. That's quite helpful. So that's a small spiritual death and rebirth. So how can we be a bit more unconditioned, by not held back by things like, oh, I've never done it before. Yeah. How can we be a little bit more outrageous in our lives? You know, when people say you can't do that, why not? So not playing it safe, taking some risks, some calculated risks, but risks nonetheless. So the problem generally is that people don't do much harm. It's that generally people don't do that much good. Yeah. So we can all do much more good. So death and rebirth, they can sound extreme, and surrendering to something else can sound slightly ridiculous. And giving your life to build a sangha can sound a bit thin and abstract and naive. But here we all are, and then we go, and then we don't get these moments back. So one question I ask myself is, well, what am I going to do with my life? So is it going to be consciously given or unconsciously taken? Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. It's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and he pushed, and they flew. Thanks.